Blake loved Iris in a way that felt larger than life. To him, she wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his best friend, his future, the person who made the world feel brighter. From the first time they met in the campus library, their connection had been undeniable. He skipped parties to be with her, gave up a promising internship just to stay in town when she had a tough semester, and never once questioned if it was worth it. Every small gesture, bringing her coffee during late-night study sessions, walking her to class in the rain, was his way of showing devotion. People said it was young love, but Blake believed it was the kind of love that lasted. He dreamed of a life with her, a modest home, shared mornings, laughter echoing through the kitchen, in a world that often felt uncertain. Iris was his safe place, his reason to hope. He saw her not as a phase, but as a forever, and in return, he trusted her with his whole heart. That trust, that unwavering belief in their future, would become the very thing that made the coming betrayal cut so deep. Because you can only be shattered by the ones you let all the way in. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that clung to the edges of summer. Warm air, soft light, everything quiet and still. Blake had just made dinner for the two of them, something simple but thoughtful. The kind of thing he always did to make Iris feel cared for. She barely touched her food. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, her eyes distant. And Blake could feel the shift in the air before a single word was spoken. When she finally looked at him, her voice cracked like a branch under pressure, fragile, trembling. "Blake, I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a freight train. His fork clattered against the plate, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time. His brain scrambled to connect dots that didn't make sense. 100 questions flooded his thoughts, but only one made it past his lips. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her face pale. "I found out last week. I've been trying to find the right time, but there isn't one." His mind spun. They were still in school, still building a life, not yet ready to hold something so big. So permanent. Fear and confusion twisted inside him. But beneath the chaos was something deeper, a crack forming in the foundation he thought was solid. It wasn't just the pregnancy that shook him. It was the unspoken distance in her eyes, the silence of something unshared, something still hiding in the shadows of her words. The truth came like a sucker punch to the soul, fast, brutal, and impossible to brace for. Days after Iris's revelation, Blake sensed something was still off. Her touches were hesitant, her voice caught in her throat too often, and her eyes, once filled with light, now carried a weight she couldn't hide. Then one night, with her hands trembling and her voice no louder than a whisper, she shattered what little was left of his world. "Blake, the baby isn't yours." For a split second, his heart refused to believe it. He blinked, waiting for her to correct herself, to say it was a mistake, a joke in terrible taste. But she didn't. Instead, she said another name. Dean, his own brother. The room spun. His knees gave out beneath him, as if gravity itself had turned on him. Blake couldn't hear the rest of her words. Apologies, explanations, regret. It all faded into a dull roar. Dean, the man he had shared bunk beds with his kids, defended in schoolyard fights, confided in about Iris. That same Dean had been with her. The betrayal wasn't just romantic. It was blood deep, bone deep. It cut through everything Blake believed in. Trust, family, loyalty, all up in flames. And what burned most wasn't just what they had done. It was the casual way they carried on, the quiet cowardice of secrets kept. Blake had believed in forever with Iris, but forever had already been broken by the two people who should have protected his heart, not crushed it. Blake had always believed that if the world ever fell apart, his parents would be the ones to steady it. They were pillars in his life, firm, faithful, unshakable. So when everything with Iris and Dean came crashing down, Blake went to them, wounded but hopeful. He wasn't looking for justice, just understanding, but instead of open arms, he was met with veiled scripture and cold neutrality. His mother sat quietly, eyes filled with something unreadable, before gently placing a hand on his shoulder and whispering, "We must rise above. Blake, this baby is still a gift." His father nodded solemnly, adding, "Dean made a mistake, but he's family. Blood must stay united." The words didn't just sting, they hollowed him out. In a single breath, they had reduced his heartbreak to a lesson in patience, his pain to a test of faith. It wasn't just betrayal from Iris or Dean anymore. It was abandonment from the very people who had raised him to value truth and integrity. They were protecting the wrong son, the golden one, the broken one, and Blake realized, in that moment, that his hurt didn't matter to them. His loyalty was expected, not earned. His silence, preferred over his truth. The air around him thickened with disbelief. He had come seeking shelter, but was handed guilt. The warmth of home turned into the chill of exile. And just like that, Blake understood he was no longer the son they stood behind. He was the one they had quietly chosen to sacrifice. Blake stood at the threshold of the only home he'd ever known, suitcase in hand. Heart splintered beyond recognition. His father's words still echoed like a gavel striking cold steel. If you can't support this family, you don't belong in it. The irony stung. He wasn't the one who had betrayed them, yet he was the one cast out. His room, once a quiet haven of dreams and late-night study sessions, was already being cleared out. The same space where he once built Lego castles and drafted college essays was being transformed into a nursery. For Dean's child, the child born from betrayal. It wasn't just the emotional blow that leveled him. It was the practical gut punch that followed. His college fund, carefully saved through years of summer jobs and tight budgets, had been emptied. Reallocated, his mother said gently, to help Dean get on his feet. Blake had never felt so erased. His sacrifices, his loyalty, all swept aside as if they'd never mattered. As he walked down the driveway, past the flower beds he helped plant as a boy, the silence was deafening. No one stopped him. No one asked him to stay. He realized then that family isn't just about shared blood. It's about who shows up when your world is collapsing, and has had chosen sides. In that moment, with the weight of loss pressing down on his chest, Blake vowed to never let them rewrite his story. They had made their decision. Now, it was his turn to make his own. Time passed, but the ache didn't. Blake found himself living out of a duffel bag, crashing on a friend's worn-out couch that smelled faintly of old takeout and cheap detergent. Days blurred together. He picked up shifts at a late-night cafe, pouring coffee for strangers while trying to piece together what remained of his life. The silence from his family was louder than any fight could have been. No calls, no texts, not even a mention of his name. It was as if he'd been neatly edited out of their story, replaced by Dean, the shining sun who had shattered everything. The final blow came when Blake, in a rare moment of vulnerability, sent a short message to his mother. "How are you?" Her reply was as cold as it was short. "We're fine." Dean stepping up for the baby. He'll be a great dad. No mention of Blake. No acknowledgement of his pain, his absence, or even the fact that he was barely holding on. For them, he no longer existed. The house he had been banished from became a sanctuary for the very people who had hurt him. And in their eyes, he wasn't just the problem. He was the past. Forgotten. Rewritten. Blake knew then that moving on wouldn't mean healing. It meant survival. He stopped checking his phone. He stopped hoping. Instead, he focused on building something, anything, out of the rubble they left him in. Because if they could erase him, he'd have to write his own story from scratch. The call came out of nowhere, just after midnight. Blake's phone buzzed against his nightstand, the screen glowing with a name he hadn't seen in years, Dean. For a moment, Blake simply stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. Torn between fury and curiosity, against his better judgment, he answered. Dean's voice, casual at first, slid through the line like oil. "Hey, Blake, we should talk." It was the same voice that used to cheer him on at soccer games, now drenched in cowardice. Dean launched into a stumbling apology. How things had spiraled, how he didn't mean for it to happen, how he was trying to make things right. Blake listened in silence, his blood boiling beneath the surface. When Dean finally said, "I just want us to be brothers again," something inside Blake snapped. His voice trembled, but not from sadness, from rage held back for far too long. "You don't get to say that," he spat. "You stole everything. And now that your world's crumbling, you remember I exist?" Dean's excuses piled on. Money troubles, Iris leaving, their parents struggling, but none of it mattered. Blake saw it for what it was. Desperation wearing a mask of remorse. He'd spent years patching up the wounds Dean left behind. Now Dean wanted him to play savior? No, Blake wasn't that broken boy anymore. With a final breath, he cut him off. "You chose your path, Dean. Now walk it. Alone." Then, with steady fingers, Blake hung up and didn't look back. A few weeks after that final call with Dean, Blake received a link from a cousin he hadn't heard from in ages. No message, just a headline. Local crypto startup exposed as fraud scheme. At first, he scrolled past it. Scam news wasn't his thing. But then he saw the name. Dean Whitaker. His heart dropped, but not out of shock, out of bitter confirmation. The article laid everything bare. Dean had been the poster boy for a flashy crypto startup, luring in investors with promises of impossible returns. Among the victims, Blake's own parents. They had funneled their retirement savings into the scheme, convinced by Dean's silver tongue and charm. The house Blake once called home had been sold at a loss to cover mounting debt. His old room, turned nursery, was now empty. The carefully curated life his parents built had unraveled, brick by brick, under the weight of their golden boy's lies. Blake didn't feel joy reading the article. He felt something colder, clarity. The karma they once preached, the divine justice they used to silence his pain, had finally knocked on their door. He learned they now lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, scraping by. Dean had been abandoned by Iris, who took the child and left him in the dust. Blake drove by once, parking across the street. He saw his father limping between diner tables, apron stained. Pride long gone. His mother, once so composed, looked smaller behind counter. And Blake? He sat in the car, eyes steady, heart intact for the first time in years. Blake didn't plan to return. But curiosity, that old ghost, drove him to the neighborhood where his story began and ended. He parked across from the building, a rundown apartment complex nestled above a faded strip mall. It was a far cry from the two-story house with trimmed hedges and Sunday morning sunlight spilling through lace curtains. From his car, Blake watched the front door open. His mother stepped out, her once perfect hair tied back in a messy bun, her movements slow and tired. A moment later, his father emerged, shoulders hunched, work uniform wrinkled, holding a lunch wrapped in foil. Blake didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply watched the people who once called him selfish now dragging their feet under the weight of their own choices. There was no satisfaction, no smugness, just a strange, bittersweet stillness. They looked like shadows of who they used to be, humbled not by wisdom, but by consequence. And Blake, the boy they cast out, now stood on the other side of the glass hole. He'd spent years trying to be enough for them, trying to win their love by being obedient, forgiving, patient. But now he saw the truth. He was never the problem. He just refused to bend. As he pulled away, he didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt real, solid, grounded in a peace they could never give him. That place no longer held power over him. It was just a backdrop to a life he'd finally chosen to leave behind. In the quiet of his apartment, Blake sat by the window, watching the afternoon light fade into a soft amber glow. It had been years since he'd walked away from everything. His family, the betrayal, the house that no longer felt like home. For so long, he carried their absence like a wound, but now it felt more like a scar, something healed, though never forgotten. He no longer needed their approval, their forgiveness, or even their presence. He had built something for himself, small but solid. The peace he found didn't come from reconciliation or resolution. It came from choosing himself over and over again. The final chapter wasn't about returning home or making amends. It was about understanding that leaving was the healing. Blake no longer looked back with anger. Instead, he looked ahead with clarity. The family that once tried to break him had only taught him how to stand on his own. Their silence was no longer punishment. It was freedom. And as he stood up to pour himself a cup of coffee, a quiet smile formed on his lips. He had survived the fire, and somehow he had come out of it whole. In today's world, where loyalty is often tested and family bonds can be more fragile than they seem, Blake's story reminds us of the power in choosing yourself. Sometimes, the people closest to you won't see your worth or protect your heart, and that's not your fault. What matters most is setting boundaries and valuing your peace over forced forgiveness. You are not obligated to carry the weight of someone else's mistakes. Walk away from what breaks you and walk toward the life you deserve. Healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means finally putting yourself first. And that's okay.